Hello and welcome to this Adapty Quickstart guide for Flutter applications. Today we'll be taking a look at the Focus Journal project and integrating the Adapty SDK into the project, creating a paywall, and setting up a simple purchase flow. Follow along with the information available to you in the description or on screen, and let's get started. Now let's take a look at the Focus Journal project in its starter state before we've done any kind of integration with Adapty. You'll see on the screen here that I've got it running in a simulator. It's a very simple application. Really, it's just been built in order to facilitate this demo. We're going to enter in a new focus. So I'll just say recording this demo is my focus for today. I'm going to save that entry, and it shows you that it's saved successfully. And then if I try to go view the history, you're going to see this little dummy paywall that we've created that allows you to subscribe or not. And so if you hit subscribe, it doesn't really do anything. It just unlocks the functionality and allows you to see the history. So that mechanism that we've built into the starter, we're going to overhaul and make it work with a real paywall once we integrate Adapty into the project. So you can see here then a reverse chronological view of the entries. We provide you with a couple of entries to get started, and then any ones that you add will appear towards the top of the screen. So you can now see that this is our premium content that we've now unlocked through the purchase of that subscription. Again, right now, just sort of mocked while we start from the starter. So let's jump into actually integrating the Adapty SDK and then getting it set up to show a paywall. The first thing you want to do is visit our GitHub page for the Flutter SDK. And so that's provided in the description, the link for that. A couple things to take a look at are the documentation. You can see there's all kinds of great documentation for how to use the Flutter SDK in your project. The example folder inside this repo also gives you a way to take a look at the finished product here. The Focus Journal app that we're going to be adapting today to add the Adapty integration is going to be included in there. In the main branch, you'll see the completed version, and in a separate branch called Starter, you'll be able to find the starter version of the project to kind of follow along. And then last thing I'll say is always take a look at the releases section to see what the latest release is for the project. And that will help guide you on what version you should enter into your pub spec in order to make sure that Flutter downloads the correct version of the SDK. All right, the next thing that we're going to do is open up the starter project using Visual Studio Code. So you can see here that I've already got it open, and I'm already in the starter branch, so that I'm in that beginning state before we've done any integration with Adapty. And the first thing you wanted to do when you get this set up, and whether it be your own app or this demo app, if you're following along, is you're going to want to install the Adapty SDK into your project. The way you do that in a Flutter project is you go to the pubspec.yaml file. And just scroll down to the dependency section. You can see that Flutter is itself a dependency. We're going to add to that list the Adapty SDK. It's very simple. You just simply name the SDK and then provide a version number, and it then tells the system next time you run an installation of the dependencies to actually install that new dependency that you've added. So I'm going to do that now. All right, so I've got the dependency added now to my list. You can see that underneath Flutter and the SDK for the actual base Flutter SDK itself, we've got then an entry for Adapty_Flutter, and we've got a version number of 3.10.0. It's partly why I wanted to give that shout out earlier to have you check out the GitHub repo, because you can check our releases and make sure that you're using the latest up-to-date version of our SDK. It's important to do that when you can. We update our SDKs fairly frequently, and there's things like bug fixes and new features in there. So the more up to date that you can stay with the dependency in your project, the more likely you'll be able to reap those benefits of having those bug fixes and those feature updates available to you in your own application. So once we have that entered into the pubspec.yaml file, we're simply going to type a command at the terminal in order to install that dependency. And that command is just flutter pub get. You can do that here in Visual Studio Code if you have an embedded terminal, or you can open up a separate terminal and do that separately. So once we run flutter pub get at our terminal, you can see that it's going to download and install both the Adapty Flutter project itself and also any other elements that it needs as dependencies. And so now the Flutter SDK from Adapty is now available to you in the project, and we can proceed to the next step. All right, once you set it up to install the Flutter SDK from Adapty using the updated pubspec file, we need to go in and actually install the CocoaPods that are necessary for a native iOS build. So from your terminal window, whether it be inside of Visual Studio Code or if you've got just a separate terminal window open, you're going to want to cd into the iOS folder that exists and then install the pods, and then you can jump back out. So we're going to jump into iOS. It's going to install those related CocoaPods. And you should see a message that looks something similar to what you see on my screen, which is that it installs Adapty and the Adapty plugin, Flutter, things like that. And then it generates a pods project. and sets it up, and everything should be good. There shouldn't be any errors. So as long as you don't see any overt errors in this console output, you should be good to go. Okay, so the next step that we're going to perform is to do a little bit of setup before we actually get into the sort of nitty-gritty of the code of integrating Adapty. And that's to set up a constants file to allow us to easily fetch things like the SDK key and any other constants that we need to use throughout the application as it relates to Adapty. So we've actually, in the starter project, already have a type called constants.dart inside your lib folder. So feel free to use that if you're following along. And otherwise, you can just put this information wherever you store your other constants in your project. That's totally fine. So you can see here in the starter, it's basically blank. There's nothing in here. I'm going to add in the constants that we're going to need. So one is the API key, one is the access level ID, and one is the placement ID. And we'll see those in use in a little bit. All right, so the next thing to do is to go into your main.dart file, and we're going to initialize the Flutter SDK from Adapty. First thing you want to do is go up to your import statements and add in some imports so that you can actually use the Adapty Flutter SDK inside of the main file. Below the initialization of the ProfileManager, we're actually going to import we're going to put in the code to actually activate the SDK. So let's do that now. That's going to be wrapped in a try-catch block because some of these functions can return errors. They can throw errors. So I want to make sure that we're trying and catching that stuff. But basically how it works is you're going to call the Adapty SDK itself and call the activate function on that, and what it takes is an Adapty configuration object. Now the minimum you have to provide here is the API key, which we're pulling from the app constants, but there are other additional parameters that you can pass into the configuration if you want to do certain things like turning off IP tracking and various other kind of additional settings that you can configure at launch or at activation of the Adapty SDK to make it perform a certain way. So feel free to take a look at our documentation on our website to find out more information about those optional parameters, but at a minimum, you want to activate it with your API key. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to set up on this data update profile stream, a listener, so that when the profile gets updated, it automatically will call out to our ProfileManager and it will perform an update, right? We're going to use that ProfileManager to keep track of the user's profile throughout the application. So whenever that profile gets updated by the Adapty SDK itself, right, we receive a new one, an updated one, we want to make sure that we're handling that update and making sure that it's propagating throughout the rest of our application, right? That state is gettable by everybody else. So this little thing right here is going to set up a listener to listen for that and then make those changes. This on profile update function is red right now because the ProfileManager doesn't yet have this function. So in the next step, we're going to go through and configure that function. So don't worry that right this moment, this is red. It'll be fixed in just a moment. All right, so the next step is to go into your ProfileManager, and we're going to make a few edits here. The ProfileManager should already exist in your starter project, but it's been essentially mocked to fake out the actual functionality, because before we had the Adapty integration, we didn't have any kind of purchase management at all. And so it was just mocked in order to be able to do the demo at the beginning, but we're going to go ahead and replace that with real functionality. First thing you want to do is add some additional import statements to the top of your file. We're going to import the Adapty Flutter SDK itself and also our constants file so we can use that inside of the project. The next thing we're going to do is add in a variable to an Adapty profile that allows us to store and track the customer profile over time. So we're going to go ahead and add that to our list of variables. And then we're also going to add in a getter to be able to get and use that into our getter section. So now we have an Adapty profile that we can populate with data and use throughout our project. So inside of our refresh profile function that you'll see in the starter, where we've basically just kind of faked out a pretend network delay to simulate talking to the network and getting updated data for purposes of the demo starter, we're going to remove that functionality. So basically this simulated network call, I'm going to delete that and replace it with an actual call out to get the real profile. And so we're going to do that here in the try block. So we call out to Adapty and we say get profile, and that will go fetch the latest profile from our servers. I'm going to store that in this profile variable and then update our customer profile property with that information. And then also we're going to call this function update premium status, which we don't quite have yet. We're going to add in the next step, but that will then make sure that we analyze that profile and see if the user has an active premium subscription. All right, the next step is to go in below the refresh profile function and add in the update premium status function. We'll take a quick look at this. We're checking to make sure that the profile is not nil. And if it is, then we know that the user doesn't have a profile and therefore hasn't paid for anything. So the premium status can be set to false in that case. However, if there is a customer profile object, we're then going to take a look specifically at the access levels array and look for the access level ID that we've defined in our constants to see if that is present within the access levels that exist. You can't have more than one, so we're looking for that specific access level by ID. And then we're grabbing that access level and checking to see if it's null. And again, if it is, then we know that the user hasn't paid for anything. And so it's false. Otherwise, we're going to check the 3 flags inside of our access level. One is called isActive, one is called isInGrace period, and one is called isLifetime. And so if any of those are active, we're then going to assume that isPremium is true. And if they're all false, then we know that they don't have premium access, and so they don't get that. And then lastly, we're going to go ahead and notify the listeners to make sure that others that are listening within the app, listeners that are there, can be updated of that change to the customer profile. Okay, so the next step is to actually create a paywall view so that we can show our value proposition to our users and hopefully get them to upgrade and pay for a subscription. So to do that, we're going to create a new file inside of our views folder, and it's going to be called paywallview.dart. All right, so now that we have the file created, I'm going to go ahead and paste in the code that I've got from the written tutorial, which is linked in the description. Feel free to go check that out, or you can check the GitHub repo itself. So this is a pretty long file, has lots of stuff in it. A lot of this is pretty boilerplate, Flutter view stuff, widgets and things like that. So I'm not going to go through the entire file. You can feel free to peruse that at your own convenience if you like. But I am going to take a look at some of the specific sections that have to do with working with the Adapty SDK in a paywall view like this and being able to display the paywall, get the properties of the products, display them on screen, and manage the purchase process. So the first thing we're going to do is take a look at the imports. We're importing the Adapty Flutter SDK, the library itself. We're importing the ProfileManager because as we get a purchase completed, we want to update the profile universally within the app using our single source of truth, which is the ProfileManager. And we have our constants file as well, just to active to get to a few of our constants. All right. So inside the paywall view, we've got our paywall view state. As part of that init state, we're loading the paywall using the load paywall function. And so that's what I'm going to call out. We're first going to go into the Adapty library and run the get paywall function that takes in a placement ID. So we're going to get the paywall with the placement ID that we pull out of app constants. And then once we have the paywall object, we can then call this other function on Adapty that is called get paywall products. And that will go into the paywall and fetch the actual products that are connected to that paywall and give it to you as an array. So whether that be Android products, iOS products, whatever, it's going to give you the right information, and then you can work with that from there. So once we have the products, we're going to set it up as a property right within our class so we can use it, and then we can go off and we can design out our actual buttons and things like that, right? The UI itself. So further down, we've got make purchase, which we're going to come back to in just a moment, and restore purchase as well. And if we just kind of continue to scroll down, we can look at kind of all the different parts of the UI that we're setting up. And in particular, I just wanted to kind of call out a couple of things related to actually displaying product information within that UI. So you'll see things like here, when we're working with the product, we've got things like localized title, localized description, localized price, localized string. So those are really handy getters for you, whether it be the title, the description, the price that you want to display on the screen. The localized versions of that are really handy. They give it to you as a string, so it makes it easy to put into the UI. And also, they're localized based on the locale of where the person is. So you're going to get things like a localized language if we have that, right? And then also stuff like a localized price, the number, and also a localized currency symbol. So you get all that stuff by using these localized versions. So I just wanted to call that out as a handy way to dig into that product object and get those relevant things that you might need to set up your UI. You've displayed the UI, you've given people buttons, you've given them options, you've given them hopefully calls to action, right? Try to sort of induce them to purchase. And let's say that they hit one of those buttons and they do want to purchase a subscription. The make purchase function is what we're going to call, and we pass in the product. And basically how it works is you just call the make purchase function, which passes in a product on Adapty. So it's very similar. And you're going to get back a purchase result. So the purchase result you can switch off of, and you can look for specifically success. So there's several that you want to keep an eye on. There's Adapty purchase result success. There's result user canceled, and there's result pending. So in this example application that we're doing here in the tutorial, we're not doing a whole lot with the pending or the user cancel. We're just kind of doing nothing. But you would, in a production app, you'd want to be a little bit more verbose with, how you're going to get users, how they're going to react, how the UI will react and display some kind of message to the user. In the case of user canceled, they have specifically canceled the transaction, so probably not a lot to do in that case. Maybe offer them some kind of discount, and that would be an option for you at that point in your logic to say that maybe this wasn't a good enough deal, and if you have a different deal that you could present them, perhaps that would be a signal to you that you could show that to them. But at a minimum, probably do not much of anything, and at maximum, maybe show them an alternate offer. And the result pending is not used very much. It's when the transaction isn't complete. So feel free to look at our documentation for how that works, but it's not a common use case. The most common, hopefully, for you is going to be success. In the case of success, we pass in to that case in the switch the updated profile. So you get a profile back from Adapty that includes the subscription information, the purchase information, the transaction that just occurred, with whether it be the App Store or Google Play, depending on which platform they're on. And then at that point, you have the opportunity to take that profile and do with it what you need to do, right, to store it. So in this case, we're going into the ProfileManager and we're running that on-profile update method that we had implemented to make sure that that ProfileManager has a new source of truth on the profile, and we can then use that new profile to base our decisions around: have they purchased, is it active, all that kind of fun stuff can be tracked that way. So we're calling out to update the profile, and then we're just basically giving them a little message saying, successful, welcome to premium, and moving on from there from a UI perspective. So this is the paywall view. Like I said, there's a lot of boilerplate in here on kind of setting up the view itself. Feel free to check that out if you like. But those are kind of the different pieces that I wanted to point out related to both showing paywall data and also processing the transaction. Something you want to do in the main.dart file after you create the paywall view is create a route for it so that the app knows how to navigate to the paywall view when it needs to. So down here in the widget build here that we're doing at the bottom of the main.dart file, you can see we have a routes. And right now your starter project should have the history route already in there because that came with the starter. We want to add another route to show the paywall view. So the way that works is you just provide the paywall endpoint, and then you're going to tell the system that it needs to create a paywall view object, right, and display it. So just follow the same format you see for history, but you're going to use the paywall view instead. All right, so the last code change we need to make is in our home view. So you're going to want to navigate to the lib folder, the views folder, and then the home view.dart file. And specifically what we want to look for is the view history function. So this is a function that is used whenever that view history button is pressed on that home view. And right now, as it exists in the starter project, we've got it set up to either go to the history view or set up a mock purchase like I showed you in the demo. And so we're going to change this to actually show the paywall for real instead. So we're going to go down here into our if else and delete this show mock purchase dialog function and replace it with a show paywall function instead. So now what we've got is a simple if else, right? If the profile manager tells us that the user has paid for premium, which is now real, right? It's actually connected to Adapty and checking to see if that customer profile contains the right premium credentials. Then we navigate over to history. And otherwise, we're going to use this show paywall function that we are about to create that will actually go off and show the paywall view. So if the user hasn't purchased a subscription, then we're going to use this show paywall view. So here we've got our show paywall function. And so we're going to set up our result to navigate over to the paywall view. And if the purchase was successful, we want to refresh the profile and navigate to history. So what this means is when the user succeeds at a purchase after showing the paywall view, it's going to automatically show the history view, which really is what we want, but we don't want to sort of make them tap it again. So that's kind of why this is set up that way, is in order to be able to show the history view directly after the purchase has been completed. And here's a demo of the finished Focus Journal project running on iOS. First, we're going to enter our focus for the day and save it. And we're going to view the history, which is going to take us to a paywall view, where we're going to choose one of the options, go through the standard iOS payment flow, and then it will unlock the history view and give us a look at the premium features. Thanks for watching.